I never thought I'd see such fury in my own son's eyes. "Transfer it now or else, Mom!" Clark Beaufort screamed, his face red with rage as he slammed his fist on my kitchen table. The coffee cups rattled, spilling their contents across the weathered wood surface. His wife Evie flinched behind him, clutching their youngest daughter Sydney's hand so tightly the child whimpered. My other grandchildren, Pete, age 14, and little Sadie, barely 8, stood frozen in the doorway.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
Their eyes wide with terror at their father's explosive outburst. The silence that followed was deafening. 23 years of widowhood, of careful planning, of quiet dignity, had led to this moment. My son, the boy I'd raised with love and sacrifice, was threatening his own mother over money he believed was rightfully his. Money that represented not just my late husband's final gift to me, but my security, my independence, my very survival. But what Clark didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the $5 million Joe Beaufort had left me wasn't the whole story. Not even close. Let me take you back to where this really started, because the truth is always more complicated than it appears on the surface. My name is Flora Beaufort, and at 72 years old, I've learned that family can be your greatest blessing, or your deepest wound, sometimes both at the same time. Joe and I met in 1968, at a small diner in Cedar Springs, a forgotten town nestled in the mountains of North Carolina. I was 19, working double shifts as a waitress to support my ailing mother. Joe was 22, fresh out of the army, with calloused hands and dreams bigger than our tiny mountain community could contain. He had this way of looking at me like I was the most important person in the room, even when I was just refilling his coffee cup for the third time. We married 6 months later in a ceremony so small it barely qualified as a wedding. Joe wore his father's old suit, and I wore a dress I'd sewn myself from fabric bought with tip money. We had $17 between us and a one-bedroom apartment above Murphy's hardware store, but we were rich in the ways that mattered most. Joe had this gift: he could fix anything. Cars, appliances, broken dreams. Word spread quickly through Cedar Springs about the young man who could resurrect dead engines and restore hope along with them. Within 2 years, Joe's auto repair had grown from a single-bay garage behind our apartment to a 3-bay shop on Main Street. Clark was born in 1971, during one of the worst winters Cedar Springs had ever seen. The roads were impassable for weeks, and Doc Henderson had to ski to our apartment to deliver our son. Joe cried harder than the baby that night, holding our red-faced, screaming miracle, and promising he'd give this child everything he'd never had. Maybe that was our first mistake. By the time Clark turned 5, Joe's business had expanded beyond anyone's expectations. He'd started buying broken-down cars at auctions, fixing them up, and selling them for profit. What began as a side venture quickly became more profitable than the repair shop itself. Joe had an eye for potential that others couldn't see. He'd spot a rusted shell of a Mustang or Camaro, and envision it gleaming on someone's driveway. "Flora," he'd say, his eyes lighting up as he described his latest find, "this one's going to set us up for life." And he was right, more often than not. The money started coming in faster than we knew how to handle. Joe, ever the practical man, invested every spare dollar. Real estate, stocks, bonds. He had an intuition about money that seemed almost supernatural. By 1980, we owned half the commercial properties on Main Street, and had investments scattered across 3 states. But we lived the same way we always had. Same small house, same modest clothes, same values. Joe drove his work truck until it literally couldn't be repaired anymore, and I continued shopping at the discount grocery store even when we could afford much more. We wanted Clark to understand the value of hard work, to appreciate what he had without taking it for granted. Looking back now, I wonder if we overcorrected. Clark grew up knowing we were comfortable, but never understanding the true extent of Joe's success. When his friends got new bikes, Clark got a refurbished one from the shop. When they went on fancy vacations, we camped at the state park. We thought we were teaching him humility and work ethic. Instead, we may have been teaching him that his parents were small-minded and limited in their thinking. The first real crack in our family foundation appeared when Clark turned 16. He'd been accepted to Duke University, a dream come true, but when we told him he'd need to work part-time and take out student loans to help with expenses, he exploded. The Maxton family just bought their kid a BMW for graduation, he shouted. And you're telling me I have to scrub dishes to pay for college? What's wrong with you people? Joe and I exchanged glances across the kitchen table. We had the money to pay for Duke twice over, but we believed Clark needed to have skin in the game, needed to understand that nothing worthwhile came without effort. Son, Joe said quietly, money you don't earn has a way of disappearing. Money you work for stays with you. Clark stormed out that night, and didn't speak to us for a week. He went to Duke, did well academically, and graduated with a business degree, and a mountain of debt that Joe quietly paid off without telling him. Clark never knew about that gift, never knew about the dozens of other times Joe had smoothed his path without taking credit. After college, Clark moved to Charlotte and married Evie Sands, a lovely girl from a wealthy family who was accustomed to a certain standard of living. They had 3 beautiful children and built a life that looked perfect from the outside. Big house in an exclusive neighborhood, private schools, country club memberships, exotic vacations. But it was all built on credit and expectations of future inheritance. Joe and I watched from a distance as our son tried to keep up with his in-laws' lifestyle, taking on more and more debt, always assuming that his parents' nest egg would eventually bail him out. We never corrected his assumptions about the size of that nest egg, never revealed that Joe's careful investments had grown into something far beyond what Clark imagined. When Joe was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at age 71, everything changed overnight. The man who had built our fortune through careful planning and hard work suddenly faced his own mortality. We had perhaps 6 months together, and Joe was determined to use that time to secure my future. "Flora," he said, during one of our late-night talks in the hospital, his hand weak but warm in mine, "I'm going to leave you everything." "Not Clark, not yet. He's not ready for this kind of responsibility, and frankly, I'm not sure he ever will be." The final will was simple and clear, $5 million directly to me, with the remainder of the estate, worth considerably more, held in trust with specific conditions for Clark's eventual inheritance. Conditions that required him to demonstrate financial responsibility, family loyalty, and genuine care for my well-being. Clark didn't know about the trust. He only knew about the $5 million, and in his mind, that money was already his. Joe died on a Tuesday morning in March, with spring rain pattering against the hospital windows, and my hand holding his until his breathing finally stopped. The funeral was small, just the way he would have wanted it. Local folks from Cedar Springs, who remembered the young man with dreams, old customers, whose cars he'd brought back to life, and neighbors who'd watched us build our modest empire, one repair at a time. Clark flew in from Charlotte with his family, and I could see the calculations running behind his eyes, even as we laid his father to rest. During the reception at our house, he kept glancing around with a new kind of assessment, as if seeing our simple home through the lens of its hidden value for the first time. "Mom," he said, pulling me aside while Evie managed the children, and the other mourners helped themselves to casseroles and coffee cake. We need to talk about your situation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Your situation, as if I were a problem to be solved, rather than a woman grieving her husband of 53 years. What situation is that, Clark? I asked, though I already knew where this conversation was heading. Well, you can't possibly stay in this big house all by yourself, and managing $5 million. Mom, that's serious money. You're going to need help. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. When had he become this man who measured everything in dollars and logistics? When had he stopped seeing me as his mother, and started seeing me as a responsibility to be managed? I've been managing just fine for 72 years, I said quietly. I think I can handle a few more. His laugh was sharp, dismissive. Mom, be realistic. You've never dealt with investments or financial planning. Dad handled all that. You'll need advisors, accountants, someone to make sure you don't get taken advantage of. The irony wasn't lost on me. Joe had included me in every financial decision from the very beginning. I knew exactly which properties we owned, which stocks were performing well, which bonds were coming to maturity. I'd been his partner in building our wealth, not just a beneficiary of it, but Clark didn't know that. In his mind, I was the little woman who'd stayed home and kept house, while the men handled the important matters. I appreciate your concern, I told him, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. That was the beginning of what I came to think of as the campaign. Over the following weeks, Clark called daily with suggestions, concerns, and increasingly urgent recommendations about my financial future. He'd researched financial planners in Charlotte, found excellent senior living communities, even looked into financial management services that specialized in protecting elderly widows from making costly mistakes. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Clark would present his latest research with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered fire. I would politely decline, and he would respond with barely concealed frustration. Mom, you're being stubborn, he said during one particularly tense phone call. I'm trying to help you here. You can't just sit on $5 million like it's money in a coffee can. I'm not sitting on anything, Clark. I'm living my life. What life? You're rattling around in that old house, driving Dad's ancient pickup truck, shopping at the same grocery store you've been going to for 40 years. That's not living, that's existing. His words stung because there was a grain of truth in them. I was lonely. The house did feel too big some days. Joe's absence was a constant ache that no amount of money could heal. But loneliness wasn't the same as helplessness, and grief wasn't evidence of incompetence. The first time Clark came to visit after the funeral, he brought Evie and the children for what he called a family meeting. We sat around my kitchen table, the same table where I'd just served them my homemade apple pie, while Clark laid out what he called his transition plan. We've been thinking, he began, and I noticed how Evie shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and we believe the best thing would be for you to move closer to us. There's a wonderful senior community about 15 minutes from our house. Independent living, but with support services available when you need them. I don't need support services, I said. I need my garden, my neighbors, my home. Mom, that's exactly the kind of thinking that worries us. You're not seeing the big picture here. Cedar Springs is dying. Half the businesses on Main Street are boarded up. What happens when the grocery store closes? When the doctor retires, you'll be stuck out here with no resources. I could have mentioned that I owned 3 of those boarded-up businesses, and was collecting steady rent from the tenants, who'd moved into the renovated spaces. I could have told him about the medical practice I'd helped finance, ensuring that Cedar Springs would have health care for years to come. I could have explained that my simple mountain town was actually experiencing a quiet renaissance, with young families drawn to its affordable real estate, and older residents committed to preserving its character. Instead, I asked, "And you think Charlotte is the answer?" "I think family is the answer," Clark said, his voice taking on the patient tone adults use with difficult children. "I think having people who care about you nearby is important when you shared it in your stage of life." My stage of life. 72 and healthy, sharp-minded and capable, but suddenly relegated to elderly irrelevance, because I'd outlived my husband. Evie finally spoke up, her voice gentle but concerned. "Flora, we just want to make sure you're safe and happy. The money from Joe's estate could buy you a beautiful apartment in Charlotte, close to us and the grandchildren. You could see Pete and Sadie and Sydney whenever you wanted." It was a kind offer, genuinely meant, but it came with an assumption that cut deep, that my happiness was something to be purchased and arranged by others, rather than something I was capable of creating for myself. "I appreciate that," I said, "but my happiness is right here. This is where Joe and I built our life together. This is where our memories are." Clark's patience finally snapped. "Memories don't pay bills, Mom. Memories don't drive you to doctor's appointments or help you when you fall and break a hip. You're being sentimental about things that don't matter anymore. Everything that matters to me is in this house," I said firmly. "Everything that made your father and me who we were happened in these rooms, on this land. I'm not leaving." "Then we'll just have to find another solution," Clark said, his tone suggesting this was a temporary setback rather than a final decision. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of 50 years of family dinners, birthday celebrations, and quiet conversations. The house felt different now, not empty but watchful, as if it too understood that everything was about to change. That night, I called Noel Bronte, Joe's lawyer and our friend for over 30 years. "Noel," I said, "I think it's time you and I had a serious conversation about that trust." The conversation with Noel Bronte was both enlightening and troubling. We met at his office in Asheville, a drive I'd made countless times with Joe over the years, but never alone with such weighty matters on my mind. "Flora," Noel said, settling into the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, Joe was very specific about his concerns regarding Clark. "The trust isn't just about money, it's about ensuring Clark develops the character traits that wealth requires." He opened a thick folder and pulled out documents I'd signed months earlier, during those final weeks when Joe could barely hold a pen but was determined to protect my future. "The total estate value is approximately $18 million, Noel continued. "Clark knows about the $5 million that came directly to you, but he has no idea about the trust. Joe wanted it that way, at least initially. 18 million. Even knowing we were well off, the number still took my breath away. Joe had been even more successful than I'd realized." "What are the conditions?" I asked, though Joe and I had discussed them during those long hospital nights. "Clark must demonstrate financial responsibility for 2 consecutive years, no excessive debt, no gambling, no frivolous spending. He must show genuine care and respect for your well-being and autonomy, and perhaps most importantly, he must prove he can be trusted with family relationships, not just family money." As Noel spoke, my phone rang. Clark's name appeared on the screen for the 3rd time that day. "Don't answer it," Noel advised gently. "Let me guess, he's been calling constantly with suggestions about how you should manage your inheritance." I nodded, feeling a mixture of sadness and frustration. "Multiple times a day. He seems to think I'm incapable of making any decisions about my own life." "That's exactly what Joe was worried about," Noel said. "Clark sees you as an obstacle to overcome, not a person to respect. The drive back to Cedar Springs gave me time to think, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd made a decision. I would give Clark every opportunity to prove himself worthy of Joe's trust, but I wouldn't make it easy for him to dismiss my autonomy in the process. The next few months followed a predictable pattern. Clark would call with increasingly urgent suggestions about my living situation, my financial management, and my general life choices. When phone calls didn't work, he'd drive up from Charlotte with his family in tow, turning what should have been pleasant visits into intervention sessions. "Mom, I've been talking to a financial advisor," he announced during one Sunday visit in late spring. "Dave Maxton. Remember the Maxton family from when I was in high school? He's doing very well now, has his own investment firm. He's agreed to look at your portfolio and make some recommendations." I didn't ask for recommendations, I said, setting down my coffee cup with more force than necessary. And I certainly didn't authorize anyone to look at my private financial information. "Well, of course not," Clark said, his tone suggesting this was exactly the problem. "That's why you need professional guidance. You can't just leave $5 million sitting in a savings account earning nothing." I bit back the urge to tell him that his assumptions about my financial acumen were laughably wrong. Instead, I said, "Clark, I appreciate your concern, but I'm handling my finances just fine." "Are you though?" Evie interjected, and I could see the genuine worry in her eyes. "Flora, we love you, but managing that kind of money is complicated. There are tax implications, investment strategies, estate planning considerations. It's not something anyone should handle alone." Little Pete, now 15, and increasingly aware of adult conversations, looked up from his phone. "Why don't you just trust Grandma to know what she's doing?" he asked with the directness of youth. Clark shot his son a sharp look. "Adults are talking, Pete. She is an adult, Dad," Pete replied, and I felt a surge of affection for my grandson's inherent sense of fairness. But Clark wasn't interested in fairness. He was interested in control. "Mom," he said, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone explaining something to a child. "I know you think you can handle this, but the reality is that you've never had to manage money on this scale. Dad took care of all the financial decisions, and now that responsibility falls to the family, it falls to me," I corrected firmly. "The money is mine, Clark. The decisions are mine. The responsibility is mine." His face flushed red. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that leads to elderly people getting scammed or making terrible investments. You're being naive, Mom, dangerously naive." That word naive stung more than he could have known. Joe and I had built our wealth through careful planning, shrewd investments, and decades of hard work. I'd been involved in every major decision, had studied market trends, had developed the same instincts for financial opportunity that had made Joe so successful. But to Clark, I was just a widow in over her head. The visits became more frequent and more intense. Clark would arrive with printed articles about protecting elderly parents from financial exploitation, brochures for senior living communities, and contact information for various professionals who specialized in elder financial management. During one particularly difficult visit in July, he brought a woman named Dr. Sandra Sands, no relation to Evie, just an unfortunate coincidence, who specialized in geriatric psychology. Dr. Sands helps families navigate the challenges of aging, Clark explained as we sat in my living room. "She's here to assess your cognitive function and help us understand what kind of support you might need." I stared at my son in disbelief. "You brought a stranger to my home to assess my mental capacity. It's not an assessment," Dr. Sands said quickly, though her presence suggested otherwise. "It's more of a conversation to help your family understand your needs and preferences." "My needs and preferences are quite simple," I said, standing up. "I need my family to respect my autonomy, and I prefer to make my own decisions about my own life." "Mom, please," Clark said, his frustration boiling over. Can't you see we're trying to help you? Can't you see that your stubbornness is putting you at risk? The only thing putting me at risk, I replied, is your inability to see me as a competent adult. Dr. Sands tried to mediate. Perhaps we could find a middle ground. Some families find it helpful to establish a family financial advisory board, where everyone has input into major decisions. Everyone? I asked. Including the person whose money it actually is. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on young Sadie, who looked up from her coloring book and asked, "Why are you being mean to Grandma, Daddy?" Out of the mouths of babes. After they left that day, I called Noel Bronte again. "Flora," he said, after I'd recounted the latest intervention attempt, "I think it's time we discussed the possibility of accelerating the trust disclosure." Joe hoped Clark would demonstrate growth and maturity naturally, but his behavior is actually getting worse. "What do you mean?" "Well, if Clark continues to treat you as incompetent, if he keeps trying to override your clearly expressed wishes, then he's failing the most basic test of the trust, showing genuine care and respect for your well-being." That night, I sat on my front porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the fireflies dance among the honeysuckle, and listening to the distant sound of evening traffic on the mountain roads. This was my life, my home, my sanctuary. The idea that my own son considered me inadequate, was almost too painful to bear. But pain, I'd learned over 72 years, could be instructive. It could show you truths you'd been too comfortable to see, force you to make choices you'd been too timid to make. Clark's next visit would be different. I was going to make sure of that. August brought a heat wave that settled over the mountains like a thick blanket, but it was nothing compared to the pressure I felt from Clark's escalating campaign to take control of my life. His visits had become more frequent and more aggressive, each one bringing new solutions to problems I didn't have. The warning signs were there if I'd been willing to see them earlier. The way Clark had started talking about me in the third person even when I was sitting right there. How he'd begun making decisions about my social calendar without consulting me first. The subtle but unmistakable shift from offering help to demanding compliance. It all came to a head on a sweltering Thursday morning, when I found Clark in my driveway at 7:30, talking on his phone while leaning against a sleek black car I didn't recognize. "Yes, she's being unreasonable," he was saying as I approached with my morning coffee. "No, she won't listen to logic. That's exactly why we need to move forward with the plan." "Good morning, Clark," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "What plan would that be?" He ended his call quickly, his face flushing slightly at being overheard. "Mom, good. I'm glad you're up early. We have a lot to discuss. Dave Maxton and I have been working on a comprehensive financial management strategy for your inheritance. We've identified several immediate concerns that need to be addressed." I took a slow sip of my coffee, studying my son's face. There was something different about him today, a manic energy that reminded me uncomfortably of Joe's cousin Eddie, who'd had gambling problems and always seemed to be one scheme away from solving all his troubles. "I wasn't aware I'd asked for a financial management strategy," I said. "Mom, that's exactly the problem. You don't know what you don't know. Dave has identified at least 12 ways you could be losing money every day by not having professional management. And how much would this professional management cost?" Clark waved his hand dismissively. "That's not the point. The point is protecting your assets and ensuring your future security. It sounds like the point is generating fees for Dave Maxton." "God, Mom, why do you have to be so suspicious of everyone who's trying to help you?" The exasperation in his voice was familiar, but there was something else underneath it, a desperation that made my stomach clench with worry. "Clark," I said carefully, "is everything all right, financially I mean? With you and Evie, His response was too quick, too rehearsed. We're fine. This isn't about us, it's about you and your refusal to face reality. But I knew my son well enough to recognize the signs. The expensive car that wasn't his usual vehicle. The designer clothes that seemed newer and more costly than his typical attire. The way his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine when he talked about money. Clark, are you in some kind of trouble? I'm not the one in trouble here, Mom. You are. You're sitting on $5 million with no plan, no protection, no understanding of what that kind of wealth requires. I set down my coffee cup and really looked at him. When had my son become this frantic, desperate person? When had his concern for my welfare transformed into something that felt more like predatory interest? What happened to your car? I asked. What? Oh, it's in the shop. Dave loaned me this one. That's generous of him. He's a generous guy. That's why I think you should meet with him. Today, actually. I've already set up an appointment. You made an appointment for me without asking. Mom, if I waited for you to agree to anything, we'd all be sitting here 10 years from now with nothing accomplished. There it was, the assumption that my reluctance to follow his suggestions meant I was accomplishing nothing, learning nothing, planning nothing. The arrogance of believing that his way was the only reasonable path forward. I won't be meeting with Dave Maxton, I said firmly. Today or any other day. Clark's face darkened. Fine. Then maybe it's time we talked about having you declared incompetent to manage your own affairs. The words hung in the air between us like a physical blow. My own son was threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent because I wouldn't surrender control of my inheritance to his friend. I beg your pardon. Mom, you're clearly not thinking rationally about this. You won't accept help, you won't listen to reason, you're making decisions based on emotion instead of logic. That's exactly the kind of behavior that suggests diminished capacity. I stared at him, trying to find some trace of the little boy who used to crawl into bed with Joe and me during thunderstorms, the teenager who'd call me crying when his high school girlfriend broke up with him. The young man who'd brought Evie home for the first time and beamed with pride when I told him I approved. That person was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Clark, I said quietly, I want you to leave. Mom, I'm trying to help you here. I'm trying to prevent you from making mistakes you can't undo. The only mistake I'm in danger of making is trusting you with information about my financial situation. Get off my property. You can't just dismiss everyone who disagrees with you. I can dismiss my son when he threatens to have me declared incompetent for refusing to hand over my inheritance to his business associates. Clark stepped closer, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that genuinely frightened me. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of cold calculation that reminded me of the way predators look at prey. Mom, you need to understand something. That money isn't just yours, it's our family's future. Dad built that wealth for all of us, not just for you to hoard like some crazy old woman. Your father left that money to me. Not to you, not to us, to me. If he'd wanted you to have it, he would have left it to you. Maybe he made a mistake. The only mistake your father made was underestimating how quickly you'd show your true colors after he was gone. Clark's phone rang, and he answered it without taking his eyes off me. Yeah, she's refusing to cooperate. No, she won't listen. I know. Okay, we'll move to plan B. He hung up and looked at me with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so condescending. Mom, I really hope you'll reconsider, because if you won't work with us voluntarily, we're going to have to explore other options. After he left, I sat on my porch for a long time, watching the morning heat create shimmers on the asphalt and trying to process what had just happened. My son, my only child, the boy I'd raised with love and sacrifice, had just threatened me. Not physically, but in a way that was potentially more devastating. He was planning something. The phone call, the mention of Plan B, the casual way he'd discussed having me declared incompetent, it all pointed to a level of coordination and premeditation that chilled me to the bone. That afternoon, I drove to Asheville and spent 3 hours with Noel Bronte, going over every detail of Joe's will and the trust provisions. By the time I left his office, I understood exactly what was at stake and exactly what Clark stood to lose if he continued down this path. "Flora," Noel said as I gathered my purse to leave, "I need to ask you something difficult. Do you think Clark might try to have you declared incompetent? Because if that's a possibility, we need to take steps to protect you." I thought about Clark's cold eyes, his calculated threats, his obvious desperation. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think that's exactly what he's planning." "Then it's time we went on the offensive," Noel replied. "Joe included provisions in the trust specifically for this scenario. Clark doesn't know it yet, but he's about to discover that threatening his mother was the worst financial decision he's ever made." The confrontation that changed everything happened on a crisp September morning, exactly 6 months after Joe's death. I was in my kitchen making breakfast when I heard cars pulling into my driveway, not one car, but 3. Through the window, I watched Clark emerge from his BMW, followed by Evie and the children from their SUV, and then Dave Maxton from a silver Mercedes I'd never seen before. But it was the fourth person who made my blood run cold, a woman in a business suit carrying a leather briefcase, walking with the purposeful stride of someone who'd done this many times before. I knew, even before they knocked on my door, that this was the moment Clark had been building toward all summer. "Mom," Clark said when I opened the door, his voice artificially cheerful, "we need to have a family meeting. I've brought some people who can help us sort everything out." "Sort what out, exactly?" I asked, not stepping aside to let them in. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be," he said. And there was something in his tone, a finality that suggested this conversation had already been decided somewhere else, by someone else. The woman with the briefcase stepped forward. "Mrs. Beaufort, I'm Jennifer Walsh from Senior Advocacy Services. Your son has expressed some concerns about your welfare and your ability to manage your financial affairs independently." I looked past her to my grandchildren, who were hanging back by the cars, clearly uncomfortable with whatever was happening. Pete caught my eye and gave me a small worried smile that broke my heart. "And you are here because I conduct competency evaluations for the county," she said, matter-of-factly, "in cases where family members have legitimate concerns about an elderly person's capacity to make sound financial decisions." "I see." I stepped back and let them all enter, not because I wanted to, but because I realized this was a battle I needed to fight from a position of strength, not weakness. We gathered in my living room, the same space where Joe and I had celebrated Christmases and birthdays, where I'd rocked Clark to sleep as a baby, where we'd planned our modest empire over countless cups of coffee. Now it felt like a courtroom. "Mrs. Beaufort," Jennifer Walsh began, settling into Joe's favorite chair without asking permission, "your son has provided me with some concerning information about your recent behavior, such as..." Clark leaned forward eagerly. "Mom, you've been refusing all reasonable advice about managing your inheritance. You won't meet with financial advisors, you won't consider moving to a safer living situation, you won't even discuss basic estate planning." "I've been managing my own affairs for 72 years, I said calmly. "I see no reason to stop now, but this is different," Dave Maxton interjected, speaking for the first time since entering my home uninvited. $5 million requires professional management. The tax implications alone could cost you hundreds of thousands if not handled properly." I turned to look at him, really look at him. Dave Maxton had been a year behind Clark in school, a mediocre student from a family that had always lived beyond their means. Now he was sitting in my living room, attempting to convince a county official that I was incompetent to manage money he'd never successfully managed for himself. "Mr. Maxton," I said, "what qualifications do you have to assess anyone's financial competence?" "I have a degree in business administration and 7 years of experience in financial planning. And what's your current client retention rate?" He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "I'm sorry, how many of your clients from 3 years ago are still with you? How many of your investment recommendations have outperformed basic index funds? What's your actual track record of success?" The silence that followed was telling. "Mom," Clark said, his voice rising, "this isn't about Dave's qualifications. This is about your refusal to act responsibly." "And what exactly would constitute responsible action in your mind?" "Transferring the inheritance to a managed account where professionals can oversee it," he said without hesitation. "Moving to a place where you have proper support and supervision, accepting that you're not capable of handling these responsibilities alone." There it was, the truth beneath all the concern and caring. Clark didn't want to help me manage my inheritance. He wanted to manage it for me. Or more accurately, he wanted his friends to manage it while he maintained influence over the decisions. "Transfer it now or else," I said quietly, repeating the threat he'd made in that final phone call the night before. His face flushed. "I never said that." "You said exactly that, Clark. Last night when I refused to sign the papers you sent over. Transfer it now or else we'll have to take other measures." Your exact words. Jennifer Walsh looked up from her notes with new interest. "Mr. Beaufort, did you threaten your mother?" "I didn't threaten anyone," Clark said quickly. "I simply explained the reality of the situation." "The reality," I said, standing up and moving to my kitchen counter, "is that my son has been plotting to take control of my inheritance since the day his father died." I returned with a folder I'd prepared after my last conversation with Noel Bronte. "Miss Walsh," I said, handing her the documents, "these are my financial statements for the past 6 months. As you'll see, I've been managing my affairs quite competently. I've made sensible investments, maintained appropriate cash reserves, and even increased the value of my portfolio by 12%. She flipped through the pages, her expression changing as she absorbed the information. "I've also included documentation of every conversation I've had with my son regarding my finances," I continued. "You'll note the escalating pressure, the threats, and the consistent assumption that my refusal to comply with his demands indicates mental incompetence rather than simple disagreement." Clark jumped to his feet. "Mom, what are you doing?" "I'm defending myself against an attack by my own son," I replied. "Something I never thought I'd have to do." Jennifer Walsh closed the folder and looked directly at Clark. "Mr. Beaufort, based on what I'm seeing here, your mother appears to be managing her finances quite competently. More competently, in fact, than many people half her age. But she won't listen to professional advice," Dave Maxton protested. "She doesn't have to," Walsh replied coolly. "She's under no legal obligation to accept advice she doesn't want. From advisors she didn't choose, regarding money that belongs entirely to her." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock Joe had bought me for our 25th anniversary. Finally Clark spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Fine, but don't come crying to us when you've lost everything and need our help." "I won't," I said simply. "Because unlike you, I understand the difference between help and control." After they left, I sat alone in my violated living room and called Noel Bronte. "It's time," I told him. "Clark has shown exactly who he is. Now it's time to show him who I am." The week following the confrontation with Jennifer Walsh was the longest of my life. I sat in my kitchen each morning, drinking coffee and staring at the mountains that had been my backdrop for over 50 years, trying to reconcile the son I'd raised with the man who'd tried to have me declared incompetent. But as the shock wore off, something else took its place, a cold, crystalline anger that clarified everything. Joe had been right. He'd seen something in Clark that I'd been too blind, or too hopeful to acknowledge. Our son wasn't just entitled or thoughtless, he was dangerous. He was willing to destroy his own mother's dignity and autonomy to get what he wanted. On Thursday morning, I drove to Asheville for what I knew would be the most important meeting of my life. "Flora," Noel Bronte said as his secretary ushered me into his office. "You look like a woman who's made a decision." "I have." I settled into the chair across from his desk, feeling more focused than I had in months. "I want to know everything. Every detail of the trust, every condition, every consequence." It's time Clark learned exactly what his father thought of his character. Noel opened the thick file that had become as familiar to me as a family photo. "The trust contains approximately $13 million in assets," he began. "Real estate, investments, business holdings, everything Joe built beyond the $5 million he left directly to you. And the conditions. Clark must demonstrate financial responsibility, respect for family relationships, and genuine care for your well-being." But Joe was specific about something else, Flora. He included what he called disqualification events. I leaned forward. "What kind of events?" "Any attempt to coerce you regarding your own inheritance. Any legal action taken against you. Any behavior that demonstrates a pattern of treating you as incompetent or incapacitated when you clearly are not." The irony was breathtaking. In trying to force me to surrender my $5 million, Clark had potentially forfeited $13 million. "Has he disqualified himself?" I asked. Noel nodded gravely. "Based on what you've told me about his recent behavior, particularly the competency evaluation and the threats, yes." Joe's language was very specific about this. He didn't want the trust used as a weapon against you. "So what happens now?" "That's up to you. The trust gives you several options. You can give Clark one final chance to demonstrate the character traits Joe hoped he'd develop. You can redirect the trust to other beneficiaries, your grandchildren, charities, anyone you choose. Or," he paused, "you can activate what Joe called the education clause. Which is, the trust remains intact, but Clark receives annual reports showing exactly what he lost and why. Every year, for the rest of his life, he'll receive documentation of the trust's growth and performance, along with a reminder of the choices that cost him his inheritance." I stared out Noel's window at the autumn leaves beginning to turn, thinking about Joe's final gift to me. Not just the money, but the power to choose how our family's story would end. "There's something else," Noel continued. "Joe left you a letter. He wanted you to read it only if Clark proved himself unworthy of the trust. He handed me an envelope, sealed and yellowed with age. My name was written across the front in Joe's careful handwriting, along with a date, the day before he died. With trembling fingers, I opened it and read, 'My dearest Flora, if you're reading this, it means our son has shown his true nature. I pray I'm wrong, but I've seen the signs for years, the entitlement, the assumption that our wealth exists for his benefit, the way he looks at you as an obstacle rather than a person. I know you've made excuses for him, as good mothers do. But wealth has a way of revealing character, not building it. If Clark can't respect you, the woman who sacrificed everything to raise him, then he can't be trusted with the legacy we built together. The choice is yours now, my love. You've earned the right to decide how our story ends.'" Whatever you choose, know that I trust your judgment completely. You've been my partner in everything that mattered, and you have the wisdom to handle this final challenge. Give our grandchildren my love, and remember that the greatest fortune we ever had was each other. Forever yours, Joe. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my purse, feeling Joe's presence as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. Noel, I said, my voice steady despite the tears on my cheeks, I want you to prepare 2 sets of documents. One gives Clark a final opportunity to prove himself worthy of his father's trust. The other activates the education clause permanently. And which set do you want me to prepare first? I thought about my grandchildren, Pete with his inherent sense of fairness, little Sadie with her artist's soul, Sydney, who still believed in the goodness of people. They deserved a chance to see their father choose correctly, even if I had little hope he would. Prepare the opportunity first, I decided. But make it clear that this is his final chance. One more act of disrespect, one more attempt to control or manipulate me, and the trust becomes permanently inaccessible to him. What are the terms of this final opportunity? He has to apologize. Not a casual, "I'm sorry if you were offended," but a genuine acknowledgement of what he's done, and why it was wrong. He has to demonstrate financial responsibility by living within his means for 6 months without any expectation of help from me. And most importantly, he has to treat me with the respect due to an autonomous adult, not a burden to be managed. Noel made notes as I spoke, and if he meets these conditions, then he gets access to the trust, with ongoing oversight to ensure he doesn't revert to his old patterns. And if he doesn't, I smiled, feeling a sense of justice that Joe would have appreciated. Then he gets to watch $13 million fund scholarships for children who understand the value of hard work and respect for their elders. As I drove home through the mountain roads, I felt lighter than I had in months. Clark had forced this confrontation, believing he held all the cards. He was about to discover that his mother had been playing a different game entirely. That evening, I called him. "Clark," I said when he answered, his voice wary, "we need to talk. There are some things about your father's will that you don't know." "What things?" "Things that will determine whether you're a wealthy man or a cautionary tale. Your choice." The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know. Clark was about to learn that underestimating his mother had been the most expensive mistake of his life. Clark arrived at my house the following Saturday morning, and for the first time in months he came alone. No Evie, no children, no business associates or county officials, just my son, looking smaller somehow in his expensive clothes, his usual confidence replaced by something that might have been genuine concern. "Mom," he said, when I opened the door, "I got your message. What's this about Dad's will? I thought we knew everything already." I gestured for him to sit at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals, where I'd helped him with homework, where Joe had taught him to play chess, where just months ago, he'd slammed his fist and demanded I transfer my inheritance. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, moving toward the pot I'd prepared. "Mom, I don't want coffee. I want to know what you meant about Dad's will." "What don't I know?" I poured myself a cup and sat down across from him, studying his face. He looked tired, older than his 43 years. There were lines around his eyes I hadn't noticed before, and his hands had a slight tremor that suggested stress or worse. "Clark," I said carefully, "are you in some kind of financial trouble?" His response was immediate and defensive. "We've been through this. I'm fine. We're fine. This isn't about me. Humor me. Are you struggling financially?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the grain of the wooden table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The house is mortgaged to the hilt. Evie's parents' business went under last year, and we've been helping support them. The kids' private school tuition is killing us, and I made some bad investments based on Dave's advice. There it was, the truth beneath all the manipulation and control. My son wasn't trying to help me manage my money, he was desperately hoping to access it for himself. How bad? I asked gently. We're about 3 months away from losing everything. He looked up at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen in his eyes since he was a little boy, genuine fear. Mom, I know I've been pushing you about the inheritance, and maybe I've been too aggressive about it, but I'm scared. I'm scared I'm going to lose my family's home, that I won't be able to provide for my children. For a moment my heart softened. This was the vulnerable son I remembered, the boy who'd come to me when the world felt too big and frightening. Why didn't you just tell me that from the beginning? I asked. Because I was ashamed, because I was supposed to be the successful one, the one who had it all figured out, because asking my mother for help felt like admitting I was a failure. I reached across the table and took his hand. Clark, you're not a failure, you're my son, and I love you, but the way you've been treating me, the threats, the attempts to have me declared incompetent, that's not how family asks for help. He pulled his hand away, his momentary vulnerability replaced by familiar defensiveness. I wasn't threatening you. I was trying to protect you from making mistakes with money you don't understand. Do you really believe that? Or were you trying to gain access to money you needed for yourself? The silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken truths and careful omissions. Both, he finally admitted. Maybe both. But Mom, $5 million, that's enough to solve all our problems, and still leave you with more than you could ever spend. Is it? I asked, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the garden Joe and I had planted together. How do you know what I could ever spend? Because you live like you're still making $30,000 a year. You drive Dad's old truck, you shop at discount stores, you act like every dollar is precious. I turned back to face him. What if I told you that every dollar is precious? That your father and I didn't build our wealth by being careless with money, even when we had plenty of it? Then I'd say you've forgotten what it's like to worry about making ends meet. And I'd say you've never really learned what it means to live within your means. Clark's face flushed red. That's easy for you to say. You and Dad had it easy. You bought real estate when it was cheap. You invested when the market was growing. You didn't have to deal with private school tuition and country club memberships and keeping up with what, Clark? Keeping up with what? With the life Evie grew up with. With what my children expect. With what success is supposed to look like. There it was. The root of everything. Clark had built a life based on appearances rather than reality, borrowing against a future inheritance to maintain a lifestyle that was always just beyond his actual means. Clark, I said, returning to my seat, what if I told you that your father left you something in his will? Something beyond the $5 million that came to me. His eyes widened. What? What do you mean? I mean that your father was a very careful man who planned for every contingency. He wanted to make sure I was provided for, but he also wanted to ensure that you had an inheritance, if you proved yourself worthy of it. Worthy, what does that mean? I pulled out the documents Noel had prepared, setting them on the table between us. It means your father established a trust for you. A substantial trust, but he included conditions. Clark's hands shook as he reached for the papers. How substantial? $13 million. The number hit him like a physical blow. He stared at the documents, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and something that looked like hope. 13 million. Dad left me $13 million. He left you the opportunity to earn $13 million. There's a difference. What kind of conditions? His voice was tight, controlled, but I could see the desperation underneath. Financial responsibility. Respect for family relationships. genuine care for my well-being and autonomy. I can do that, he said quickly. Mom, I can absolutely do that. Can you? Because your recent behavior suggests otherwise. He looked up from the papers, and I saw the exact moment when hope turned to calculation. What exactly do I need to do? You need to treat me like an adult capable of making my own decisions. You need to demonstrate that you can live within your means without relying on inheritance to solve your problems. And you need to genuinely apologize for the way you've treated me since your father died. That's it? That's all? That's everything. Clark, those aren't small things. They're the foundation of who you are as a person. He was quiet for a moment, studying the documents. What happens if I can't meet the conditions? Then the trust goes to other beneficiaries. Your children's education funds, charitable organizations. People who understand the value of respect and responsibility. And you'd really do that. You'd really give away $13 million, rather than let me have it. I met his gaze steadily. Clark, I'd rather see that money build a better world than watch it enable the person you've become. The weight of his choice settled over him like a blanket. $13 million within his grasp. If only he could remember how to be the son I'd raised instead of the man his desperation had created. When do I need to decide? He asked. You don't need to decide anything. You just need to be who your father hoped you'd become. The choice is entirely yours. I could see the wheels turning in Clark's mind as he processed the magnitude of what I'd just told him. $13 million. More money than he'd ever imagined his father possessed, sitting in a trust he'd never known existed. Mom, he said slowly, his voice carefully controlled, why didn't you tell me about this before? Because your father specifically requested that you not be told unless certain conditions were met, or in this case unless certain conditions were violated. What do you mean violated? I pulled out another set of documents that Noel had prepared, a detailed accounting of Clark's behavior over the past 6 months, documented and witnessed. Your father included what he called disqualification events in the trust, I explained. Actions that would permanently bar you from accessing the inheritance. Clark's face went pale. What kind of actions? Attempts to coerce or control me regarding my own inheritance. Legal action taken against me without justification. Any pattern of behavior that treats me as incompetent when I'm clearly capable of managing my own affairs. He stared at the documents, his hands trembling slightly. Mom, surely you don't think. I mean, I was just trying to help. Were you? Let's review what your help looked like, shall we? I opened the file and began reading from Noel's carefully documented timeline. June 15th. You brought an unauthorized financial advisor to my home and attempted to pressure me into signing documents I hadn't requested. July 3rd. You arranged for a geriatric psychologist to assess my mental capacity without my consent. August 12th. You threatened to have me declared incompetent if I didn't comply with your financial management demands. With each date, Clark seemed to shrink further into his chair. September 18th. You brought a county official to my home to conduct a competency evaluation based on false claims about my mental state, and most damning of all, September 17th. You called me and said, and I quote, "Transfer it now, or else we'll have to take other measures." I was recorded saying that, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I've been documenting everything since July, Clark. Every conversation, every threat, every attempt to undermine my autonomy. Your father anticipated this possibility. Clark slumped back in his chair, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. So the trust, I can't access it. Ever? According to the strict interpretation of your father's will, no. You violated multiple disqualification events. The trust should be redirected to other beneficiaries immediately. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the living room, a bee buzzing around the honeysuckle outside the kitchen window, the distant sound of a neighbor's lawn mower. But, I continued, and Clark's head snapped up with desperate hope, your father also gave me discretionary power over the trust. One final opportunity for redemption, if I believed it was warranted. What kind of opportunity? 6 months to prove that you can treat me with respect and live within your means. No attempts to control my finances. No suggestions about where I should live, or how I should manage my money. No involving third parties in our family business, without my explicit consent. And if I do that, then you get access to the trust, with ongoing oversight to ensure you don't revert to your old patterns. What kind of oversight? Annual reviews with the trustee, continued financial responsibility requirements. And most importantly, treating me as an autonomous adult for the rest of my life. Clark was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. Mom, I screwed up. I know I screwed up. I was so panicked about our financial situation, so desperate to fix everything, that I convinced myself you needed my help managing your inheritance. But really, I needed your help, and I was too proud to ask for it directly. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in months. I know, I said gently, and I understand desperation can make people do things they never thought they would. But Clark, the way you treated me like I was a child, like I was incompetent, like my own wishes didn't matter, that hurt me more than you can imagine. I never meant to hurt you. But you did. You called me a burden, remember? You threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent. You brought strangers into my home to assess whether I was capable of managing my own life. Tears were streaming down Clark's face now, and for a moment, I saw the little boy he'd once been. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I was wrong about everything. I was wrong to treat you that way, wrong to assume you couldn't handle your own affairs, wrong to put my financial problems ahead of our relationship. Are you apologizing because you're genuinely sorry, or because you want access to the trust? He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. Both, if I'm being honest. But mostly because I realized I almost lost my mother over money, and no amount of money is worth that. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. What I saw instead was genuine remorse, and something I hadn't seen in years: humility. Clark, I said carefully, if I give you this opportunity, it's not just about following the rules for 6 months and then getting your inheritance. It's about fundamentally changing how you see me, how you treat me, how you understand our relationship. I know, it means accepting that I'm a capable adult who doesn't need your management or oversight. I know, it means living within your means regardless of what inheritance you might eventually receive. I understand. And it means that if you violate these conditions even once, the trust is gone forever. No second chances, no appeals, no negotiations. Clark nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. What do I need to do? I pulled out the final document Noel had prepared, a formal agreement outlining the terms of Clark's probationary period. You need to sign this, you need to mean it, and you need to prove, through your actions, that you've learned something from this experience. He reached for the pen with shaking hands. Mom, can I ask you something? What? Why are you giving me this chance? After everything I've done, why not just redirect the trust to charity? I thought about Joe's letter, about the grandchildren who would be affected by this decision, about the son I'd raised and the man he could still become. Because your father believed in redemption. Because I still believe there's good in you, even if it's been buried under desperation and entitlement. And because love means giving people the opportunity to become better than they are. Clark signed the document with tears still in his eyes. Thank you, Mom. I won't let you down. You already have, Clark. The question now is whether you'll learn from it. After Clark left with the signed agreement, I sat alone in my kitchen feeling emotionally drained, but strangely hopeful. For the first time in months, I'd seen glimpses of the son I remembered, vulnerable, apologetic, genuinely remorseful for his actions. But hope, I'd learned over the years, needed to be tempered with realism. My phone rang 3 hours later. Clark's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with some trepidation. Mom, his voice was tight, controlled. I've been thinking about our conversation today. I want to make sure I understand the terms correctly. 6 months of financial responsibility, and treating you with respect, and then I get access to the trust. Something in his tone set off warning bells. Clark, it's not just about following rules for 6 months. It's about fundamental change in how you write. Right, I understand that. But specifically, what constitutes financial responsibility? Because if I have to maintain our current lifestyle, while also paying down debt, that might be mathematically impossible. I closed my eyes, feeling the first stirrings of disappointment. Clark, part of financial responsibility is living within your means. If your current lifestyle is unsustainable, then you need to change it. But the kids are already enrolled in private school for the year. Evie's used to a certain standard of living. You can't expect me to just upend everything overnight. I don't expect you to upend everything overnight. I expect you to start making responsible choices going forward. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had taken on the familiar edge of frustration. Mom, you have to understand, we have commitments, obligations. I can't just cancel the country club membership, or pull the kids out of school mid-semester. Because that's not how things work in the real world. There are contracts, social expectations, consequences for our children's education and social development. I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. Clark, are you already looking for ways to justify not changing your lifestyle? I'm being realistic about the constraints I'm working under. There's a difference. Is there? Because it sounds like you're already making excuses for why you can't live within your means. His voice rose slightly. I'm not making excuses. I'm explaining the complexities of the situation. Maybe if you understood what it actually costs to maintain a family in today's economy. Stop right there, I said firmly. You're doing it again. Doing what? Treating me like I don't understand money or the real world. Explaining things to me as if I'm a child who doesn't comprehend basic economics. The silence on the other end was telling. Clark, I continued. This conversation is exactly what your father was worried about. You can't even discuss financial responsibility without condescending to me. I wasn't condescending. I was just trying to explain. You were explaining why the rules shouldn't apply to you, why your situation is special, why you can't be expected to make the same sacrifices other people make when they're in financial trouble. That's not fair. What's not fair is that 3 hours after signing an agreement to treat me with respect, you're already arguing with me about the terms and talking down to me about subjects I understand better than you do. Another long pause. When Clark spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. I think maybe we should discuss this when we've both had time to cool down. I'm perfectly cool, Clark, but I'm also perfectly clear about what just happened here. After I hung up, I called Noel Bronte. Flora? He answered on the first ring. How did it go? He signed the agreement. But Noel, I think I may have made a mistake giving him this chance. What happened? I recounted the phone conversation, the immediate backtracking, the condescending explanations about financial constraints. He couldn't even make it 3 hours without reverting to his old patterns. I concluded. He's already looking for loopholes, already treating me like I don't understand his complex situation. Noel was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? I stared out at the mountains, thinking about second chances and whether some people were capable of real change. I want to document everything. Every conversation, every interaction. If Clark is going to prove he's unchanged, I want a complete record of it. And then I'm going to honor your husband's wishes and redirect that trust to people who understand the value of respect and responsibility. The pattern became clear over the following weeks. Clark would start each conversation with the best of intentions, expressing gratitude for the opportunity I'd given him and commitment to meeting the conditions of the trust. But inevitably, the conversation would shift to explanations of why his situation was unique, why the standard rules of financial responsibility couldn't apply to his circumstances. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said about the country club membership," he said, during one of our weekly check-in calls. "And I understand the principle, but canceling mid-year would mean forfeiting the entire annual fee. It's actually more financially responsible to maintain it through December." "Clark, that's exactly the kind of thinking that got you into financial trouble in the first place. I'm being practical. If I cancel now, we lose $12,000. If I wait until December, we at least get some value from the membership. Or you could cancel now, lose the $12,000, and save yourself from continuing to pay for something you can't afford. But we've already paid the annual fee. The money's gone regardless." It was the sunk cost fallacy, a basic principle of financial decision-making that Clark either didn't understand or was willfully ignoring. More troubling were the subtle ways he continued to treat me as if I needed his guidance and oversight. During family dinners, he would helpfully explain financial concepts to me, apparently forgetting that I'd been managing money successfully while he was still in diapers. "Mom, you might want to consider diversifying your portfolio," he said, during one particularly grating dinner conversation. "Having all your money in conservative investments might seem safe, but inflation can erode your purchasing power over time." Evie shot him a warning look, clearly remembering our previous conversations about this topic. "Clark," I said calmly, "what makes you think my portfolio isn't diversified?" "Well, I just assumed, since you've always been conservative with money, that you'd probably stick with things like savings accounts and CDs. "You assumed. Based on what knowledge of my actual investment? I just think it would be wise to have someone review your asset allocation to make sure, Clark." My voice carried a warning that even he couldn't miss. "You're doing it again." He stopped mid-sentence, finally recognizing his mistake. But the damage was done. After months of promising to respect my autonomy, he was still operating under the assumption that I needed his financial guidance. The breaking point came in November, exactly 2 months into his probationary period. I'd been battling a persistent cold and mentioned it during one of our phone conversations. "Mom, that cough doesn't sound good," Clark said, his voice taking on the overly concerned tone I'd learned to recognize as manipulation. "I think you should see a doctor. I'm planning to if it doesn't improve in a few days." "A few days? Mom, at your age, you can't take chances with respiratory infections. I'm going to call Dr. Patterson's office and make you an appointment." "Clark, I'm perfectly capable of making my own medical appointments." "I know you are, but sometimes it helps to have someone advocating for you. These doctors' offices respond better when family members call." Before I could stop him, he'd hung up and apparently called my doctor's office, because 20 minutes later I received a call from Dr. Patterson's nurse, asking if I wanted to keep the appointment my son had made for me. I was furious. Not about the medical appointment. I probably did need to see the doctor, but about Clark's assumption that he had the right to make medical decisions for me without my consent. When I called him back, his response was defensive and dismissive. "Mom, I was just trying to help. You sounded really sick, and I was worried about you." Clark, you had no right to make that appointment without asking me first. I was being proactive. I thought you'd appreciate not having to make the call yourself when you're not feeling well. What I would appreciate is being treated like an adult who can manage her own health care. God, Mom, I can't do anything right, can I? When I don't show concern, you complain that I don't care. When I try to help, you complain that I'm being controlling. There's a difference between showing concern and taking action without my consent. Fine, next time I'll let you handle everything yourself, even if you're too sick to think clearly. And there it was, the implication that my illness had impaired my judgment, that I couldn't be trusted to make rational decisions about my own medical care. I hung up without another word and called Noel Bronte. Flora, you sound upset. I need you to prepare the final documents redirecting the trust, I said. Clark has shown me exactly who he is, and it's not someone his father would want controlling $13 million. What happened? I told him about the medical appointment, about the ongoing pattern of condescension disguised as concern, about Clark's complete inability to respect my autonomy even when millions of dollars were at stake. He can't change, Noel. He's constitutionally incapable of seeing me as an equal. Even with $13 million hanging in the balance, he can't bring himself to treat me with basic respect. Are you sure about this, Flora? Once we redirect the trust, there's no going back. I thought about Joe's letter, about his warning that wealth reveals character rather than building it. Clark had been given every opportunity to demonstrate growth, maturity, and respect. Instead, he'd shown that his default setting was to treat me as someone who needed his management and oversight. I'm sure, I said. It's time to honor Joe's wishes and redirect that money to people who understand what respect actually means. The final confrontation happened 3 weeks before Christmas, in the same kitchen where this whole ordeal had begun, with Clark's screaming demand that I transfer the inheritance. I'd invited him over to discuss the trust situation, and he arrived looking haggard but hopeful. He'd clearly convinced himself that he'd been meeting the conditions successfully. Mom, he said, settling into his usual chair, I've been thinking about everything we've discussed over the past few months, and I really feel like I've made progress. I've been more respectful of your independence, and we've been working hard to get our finances in order. I placed a folder on the table between us, not the trust documents this time, but something else entirely. Clark, I need you to understand something. Over the past 2 months, I've documented every interaction we've had. Every phone call, every conversation, every assumption you've made about my capabilities. His confident expression began to falter. Despite promising to treat me with respect and autonomy, you've continued to condescend to me about financial matters I understand better than you do. You made a medical appointment for me without my consent. You've repeatedly explained why the conditions of the trust shouldn't apply to your unique circumstances. Mom, I was just trying to help. Clark, stop. Just stop. I opened the folder and began reading. November 3rd, you called Dr. Patterson's office to make an appointment for me without my permission. November 8th, you explained inflation to me as if I'd never heard the concept before. November 15th, you argued that maintaining your country club membership was financially responsible because you'd already paid the annual fee. With each entry, Clark seemed to shrink into himself. November 22nd, you told Evie in front of me that I probably didn't understand the tax implications of my investment decisions. November 28th, you suggested I needed someone to review my asset allocations because I might not understand diversification. I closed the folder and looked directly at my son. Clark, your father was right about you. You're constitutionally incapable of treating me as an equal. Even with $13 million at stake, you couldn't bring yourself to show me basic respect. I have shown you respect, No, you haven't. You've shown me tolerance. You've managed to avoid calling me a burden again, but you've never stopped believing that I am one. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of failed expectations and fundamental incompatibility. So what happens now? He asked quietly. Now I honor your father's wishes. The trust has been redirected to other beneficiaries. Your children will have their college educations fully funded through a separate educational trust. The rest will go to charitable organizations that understand the value of treating people with dignity. Clark's face went white. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Your father saw this coming, Clark. He knew that if you couldn't respect me, the woman who sacrificed everything to raise you, then you couldn't be trusted with the family legacy. But I need that money. We're going to lose everything. Then you'll learn what your father and I learned 50 years ago, how to build something from nothing through hard work and sacrifice. This is cruel, Mom. This is vindictive. This is justice. Your father worked his entire life to build that wealth, and he had very specific ideas about who deserved to benefit from it. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had witnessed this entire drama unfold. Clark, you still have your $5 million inheritance to help with. But that trust money will do more good funding scholarships for children who understand respect and hard work than it would enabling your continued financial irresponsibility. He left without another word, and I knew it would be a long time before I saw him again. But for the first time in months, I felt at peace. I'd kept my promise to Joe, honored his memory, and ensured that his life's work would benefit people who truly deserved it. The mountain sunset painted my kitchen in shades of gold and amber, and I could almost feel Joe's presence beside me, proud that I'd found the strength to make the hard choice. Sometimes love means saying no, even when it breaks your heart. Especially then. Outside, winter was coming to the mountains, but inside my home, I felt nothing but warmth. I was 72 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and finally free to live my life without apology or explanation. It had taken losing a husband and disappointing a son to find myself, but the woman I'd discovered was stronger than I'd ever imagined. And that, I realized, was worth more than all the money in the world.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.